For those who are online, we're going to give a couple minutes to let people fully join. We see people adding into the section quickly, so we want to give enough opportunity for the people who registered to all get online. So please give us a little bit of another minute or so before we start.
And just a reminder to the whole audience, this is recorded and will be posted as part of the archives in the Practical Talk session. So you'll be able to share it with your colleagues later on.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone's having a good day. This is going to be a special session of Practical Talk. Myself, Darrell Gay, my partner ArentFox Schiff, and my good buddy Jay Jamrog, who is a co-founder and futurist of I4CP, are your hosts today for this session. We have two guests. Michael Garner, who is—
Go to the next slide. Sure.
Oh, yeah, okay. Next slide. Chief Business Diversity Officer, the first Chief Business Diversity Officer, in fact, first diversity officer of the city of New York ever. And it comes from the MTA, where before the MTA and before that, the School Construction Authority, he broke all kinds of records and being able to really accomplish the goals of diversity. He sets forth records across the country that no one else has ever done before. So he really understands space better than anybody else. Our second guest is Ted Shore, who you don't see yet because he's having some technical difficulties. We hope he joins us very shortly. Teddy is currently the Julius Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina and heads their Center for Civil Rights. But Teddy also, before that, was the Director Counsel for the Legal Defense Fund and also served as a professor at the University of Michigan during the time period of the Greta decision. In fact, played a role in putting together the affirmative action plan that survived the Greta attack. Well, this is interesting because in the last month or so, people have been talking and speculating about what this SCOTUS decision, the Harvard and UNC decision mean, what impact it's going to have in education. But there's also a discussion about what impact or meaning does it have on, going to have on employment potentially, or on, MWBE. Currently, there is nothing in that decision that says it applies to either employment or MWBE, nothing at all. So that doesn't necessarily mean that they might not try to misuse it. And that's our concern. We think that we need to bring this attention to people, pay attention to what might come from this, and they aware of the things they need to be conscious of as they move forward and plan how they proceed with their programs. So that ain't what I want to first do, since Teddy is still in the midst of getting on board with us. I want to move forward in the agenda. Jay has prepared a series of slides discussing how MWBE and how diversity, what it means to corporate America and institutions. So Jay, why don't you share with us, what exactly, how does corporate America look at this whole idea of diversity?
Yeah, sure. I appreciate it, Darrell. And since I'm the non-lawyer in the group, I will try to limit myself to my legal opinions, and hopefully I'm corrected if I'm wrong. First, let me just tell you, the I4CP, we're a research organization, not a consulting organization. We discover the next practices, people practices that drive high market performance. We want to look around the corner. So go to the next slide. When we talk about high market performance, every one of our studies is very rigorous. So we build in a dependent variable around market performance because we want to know what human capital practices truly drive market performance. And we define market performance for revenue growth, market share, profitability, and customer satisfaction over the next 5 years. I want to know what high-performing organizations, those that are top quartile in all four of these, do differently than low-performing organizations. And then I want to know if there's any correlations. So go to the next slide. One of the things that we hear a lot, and there's a lot of confusion, not amongst our members necessarily, but in the population in general, is affirmative action versus diversity, equity, inclusion. So I just wanted to let people know what diversity, equity, and inclusion really means in the definitions. Diversity for most of the high-performing organizations is a mix of representatives of people in the organization. Inclusion goes a step deeper and intentionally creates an environment that welcomes all its members. Equity ensures a level playing field, sometimes investing more in unrepresentative groups, both inside and outside the organization. That's, in other words, those organizations that bid on contracts or want to be contract workers, etc., investing sometimes more in those groups. And belonging is a newer term that really sort of jumped into the fray during the COVID pandemic. That's the psychological safety to bring to your whole authentic self to work. So it's one thing to be included into a group or to a team, but it's another thing to feel I belong in that team. So it's a strategic integrated system of effects that permeate all people practices to foster a sense of inclusion and belonging. Go to the next slide. This is a study we did looking at the highest strategic level in which DE&I is addressed in organizations. You can see is addressed as part of the overall business strategy and organization stated values. When I say stated values, I'm talking about culture. So many of the better companies, 92% will say that as part of our strategy or as part of our culture. You can see down below, addresses part of our compliance strategy. That's more of an AA point of view, as a compliance sort of issue. And only 12% really focuses on that. But when we did a statistical analysis, pursuing DEI to support a business strategy or the culture of the organization is significantly correlated to higher market performance and engagement. Programs must be perceived as authentic and ingrained into the organization's thinking and behavior in order to be effective. So companies that are having a knee-jerk reaction to this SCOTUS decision are really being kind of unauthentic. And really what the better companies are doing are sticking to their DE&I programs to make sure there's consistency around how they talk about it inside their organization. So go to the next slide. So there is a business impact. One of the things we've seen in that is highly correlated with having a good DE&I program and market performance, and really stuck out to me when we looked at leadership behaviors recently, is that one of the key characteristics of a good DE&I program is when leadership establishes productive relationship with individuals of unrepresentative groups. And that's important, productive relationships, not just a relationship, but a productive one. I would call Darrell and I having a productive relationship. We work together all the time. We talk together all the time. That is what's needed in organizations with respect and dignity towards everybody. So go to the next slide. Another thing we hear a lot of is that organizations will hire a chief diversity officer simply as a token, with no budgets, no staff, no reporting relationships. So come to some of the things we've seen with our chief diversity officer board is we went deep into the structure of, excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold, the structure of D&I in their organizations. And you can see in this particular thing, this is a common structure in a well-functioning DE&I office. So you see the chief diversity officer will report to the CEO or the chief diversity council, which is part of the board, or the chief HR officer. And you can see the other reporting relationships up to the CDO. How involved is the CEO and the board of directors in DEI is a big question. If you're coming into an organization, you should ask that. How involved is the executive team and what are their goals and accountabilities around DE&I? So go to the next slide.
Before you go there, I think that's an interesting point you touch on.
Yeah.
I see a lot of companies, they create a diversity officer and they choose someone from their marketing public relations team to be their chief diversity officer. And I'd love to even have Mike on it, because to me, I've always looked at it as fabricated, because really what they're doing more worry about then is the image they're creating versus anything they're really accomplishing.
Yeah.
Mike?
Yes, so I would say that I agree that structurally, the CDO must be in a position of alignment to report directly to the top. Adequate staff, adequate resources, and the person who is your CDO needs to be qualified and most of all empowered to execute his or her daily duties and responsibilities. Because at the end of the day, this person is only evaluated on one thing. That is, how many dollars were paid to certified minority and women-owned businesses. It is not about good faith efforts. It's about results.
Correct.
You know, there's a lot of times I worked for a transportation superstar by the name of Jay Jamrog, who was the CEO of the MTA, which everyone knows is the largest transportation network in North America with more than 70,000 employees and a $54 billion capital budget. And Chairman Walter would always say that people who are mired in failure, they want you to evaluate them on their efforts, but not evaluate them on their results.
Good point.
So there needs to be a focus on results only. And if there's anything stopping diversity from being implemented, those barriers must be eradicated.
Yep. So go. I love that that story, Michael. So go to the next slide, please. When we look at where diversity, equity, inclusion is going, we see it actually getting more accountable and more responsible. So you look at the Chief Diversity Councils, you see Chief Diversity Inclusion Officer is right there at the top with the CEO, the Chief HR Officer, and the Board of Directors. They are part of the executive team and the Board of Directors. They're not separate and below it. And there's a separate Executive Diversity Council that will report up to the board. I remember one of the better companies that I used to know years ago was Pitney Bowes out of Connecticut. And their CEO used to have a diversity council. They used to report to him once a month and would spend at least 2 hours discussing diversity issues within their company. And this was back in the 90s. So they were very much in the forefront of where diversity sits in an organization. So go to the next slide, if you would. So this is a little discouraging, but it's a little too early to tell. After George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, there were a lot of pledges that were made. And so we wanted to look at further down the line, the pledges that were made and the progress that was made. And you can see that there were a lot of pledges being made around racial and gender inequities in the workplace and the environment and the general society. Companies are making progress, but as we always say, progress is slow. It's almost like 2 steps forward, 1 step back sometimes. And now with the current environment, with the SCOTUS agreement and other state legislators, it seems like we're taking 2 steps backwards and 1 step forward. So the companies that have been making progress are still going to make progress in the DE&I. They're going to be facing an uphill battle, as I hope Michael and Ted are going to talk about in a minute. But go to the next slide. One of the things that has came out of over the last 3 years that is very, to me, heartwarming is we've entered an era of human capital disclosure around DE&I. So you look at corporations and employees, there's a number of different things that are looking at the results of companies and their disclosure. There's boards and CEOs now that have to disclose to the SEC. There's standards, organization, and governing boards, whether it's in the United States or in Europe, that now require disclosure of DE&I activities and organizations, especially D. And investors want to know more about how a company is becoming more diverse, because we know diversity is highly correlated with business performance and turnover, so engagement. So investors want to know also where companies are going. So there's a whole era of disclosure that we're into now. So I'll shut up a little bit because I'm not a lawyer, and I would like to turn it over.
Before we move on, how in one of the biggest issues that we've been talking about over the last few months is we talked about the future of work. and they exist in the workplace has been the issue of talent. And corporate America and all employees have had trouble finding people across the board. How important is DEI to the issue of finding talent?
It's extremely important, Darrell. You know, if you look at the demographics only, you'll know that we are becoming a more diverse society. And if you want a good skilled workforce, you're going to have to move beyond your traditional avenues of hiring to look for where are not just skills and not just degreed people, but where are the skills out there. So many companies are moving beyond, like going to historically Black colleges, or like I even said, even going to Black churches to start recruiting people with more skills, reaching out to more minority-based and smaller companies to give them coaching and mentoring and funding so that they can become better bidders on the projects in some of the bigger organizations. This is happening a lot in Europe and the United States, especially with the global companies. Because we know that what's happening is that, I'll give a quick story. I was doing a future of work presentation to a group of people recently, and afterwards, a young African-American woman came up to me with a PhD, and she said, "You know, you're absolutely right about talent and skills. I turned down my first 3 job offers and took my 4th job offer for less money. Because when I went on the campuses of the interviews in the first 3 companies, I did not see a face that looked like mine. But I went in the 3rd one, I felt like I could belong in this company, that I could make a difference, that I didn't have to fight an uphill battle all the time in organizations. So talent, especially young talent, is looking for that diversity and inclusion when they're looking for where they want to work in the future. And the best ones are making a lot of money. You look at Chief Diversity Officer Board, we have a boutique executive placement part of our company for HR. We just placed a CDO in a small healthcare company, not really a huge one. Their starting salary is $700,000. The best companies who really want to make a difference are hiring the best, and they are reporting right up to the board.
And
So-
hey, Darrell, let me just set the stage for a second before you
Come on.
pivot over to my great friend Ted Shaw, and let me use UNC or the University of North Carolina as an example of an analysis. What is the Black student population at the university overall versus the population of the football team, the Black population? And so you look at institutions, historically, some of those who would not admit a Black student, Alabama, Mississippi State. And you ask your question, what is the Black student population versus the population of the football team? Now, Alabama, they compete for national championships every year. They're very lucrative. So it would appear to me that if there's no issue with recruiting Black student athletes to play on the football team or basketball team, why should there be an issue with recruiting Blacks to go to a law school or an engineering school at those same institutions?
Well, I think you said a good question there, Mike. And, I think the key thing that decision does not do, and I'm going to let Teddy give us his perspective on the holding the case, but I don't think anyone has ruled that discrimination is dead and over in America. All right. I don't think anyone has ruled that the problem with inclusion of people of color or the issue of diversity itself is something that's still not an issue and not a concern. The decision has not said that's not the case. They even agree the Supreme Court carved out the military, and other possible prison situations. There's a recognition there's a problem. But having said that, Teddy, as I mentioned earlier, while you weren't on yet, I introduced you as having been the former director of counsel Legal Defense Fund and having played a role in helping put together a affirmative action plan that the University of Michigan was confronted with, or the court attacked with during the Brother case. Can you share with us your perspective on what the Supreme Court held? You're mute, Teddy.
You're unmuted.
I should know better than this by now. My apologies. And my apologies about the earlier connection. I'm in a place where I am usually not. So I can't promise that I won't have the problem again. What does the SFA decision hold? In its most narrowest application, it holds that Harvard and UNC violated the Constitution and Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act in the way they structured their admissions programs. I think that the Chief Justice and a majority of the court intended to do a great deal of damage to all of the precedent that goes back to Bakke, but most importantly, Grutter, which put to bed the question of whether or not there was a holding in Bakke, and the subsequent cases, University of Texas, Fisher 1 and Fisher 2. Clearly, the Chief Justice and the majority want to end consideration of race in admissions as much as is possible, although even this supermajority constructed conservative court could not go and did not go all the way to say that colleges and universities could never think about or consider the issue of race in an application. The Chief Justice said nothing prevents a university from considering how race impacted an individual applicant's life. We'll have to see what that means, but clearly that door remains open to some degree. Here's what this decision has not done. It has not ruled in any definitive way, in spite of all of the noise that Ed Blum, who's behind these cases, and others are making. It did not rule that it extends to diversity efforts writ large. It didn't rule that all diversity efforts in employment, or for that matter, in contracting or in other places, are per se illegal or unconstitutional. Clearly, it's a step in a wrong direction for those of us who care about diversity and inclusion. But those issues are left, I think, for another day. And as I said, Ed Blum and others are making noises that they're going to make sure that they pursue these issues in other states.
Ted, do you see cases, and I know Darrell has educated me on the Virginia case, where they're going to be going after specifically Title VII and the diversity, equity, inclusion in corporate America?
Well, you say so you're talking about the Thomas Jefferson High School case, because that's in education, not in employment.
Yes.
Or do you have another case in mind?
Darrell, I'll refer to you on that one.
Yeah, that's the Thomas Jefferson case he's referring to. That's the famous Virginia case.
Yeah, so
Right, it's the education case.
yeah, Thomas Jefferson, that case in some ways parallels for those of you, us. I'm a former New Yorker. I'm always going to be a New Yorker in part, but I'm in North Carolina now. But it parallels in some ways what happens at Stuyvesant High School, which we all know. Thomas Jefferson is one of the leading public schools in the country. It did make efforts to diversify its student body because there were very few African Americans in Thomas Jefferson High School. There was a lawsuit that challenged those efforts, and in the aftermath of that lawsuit, Thomas Jefferson wanted to still pursue in other ways, more race-neutral ways, efforts that would bring about diversity. And even that has been challenged, although the Fourth Circuit has put a hold on that challenge, or let me put it this way, didn't rule favorably on that challenge. But these cases are going to continue. As I said, Ed Bloom has made clear that anything that he thinks may be a proxy for a race, they're going to pursue. This isn't going to end our struggles about what is possible legally in pursuit of diversity inclusion. Those issues are not decided in any kind of final way, although what universities can do in admissions has been constricted as a consequence of this opinion. There's a whole lot more that I am tempted to say, but I talk too much, and so I probably want to leave it for questions and answers. But there's a lot more that one can and should say. The crux of all of this, though, is, in my view, the false equation pursued by the Chief Justice and a majority of the court and many, many conservatives that equates race consciousness with racism and discrimination that should be illegal. That's a false equation. And we still are struggling over that false equation and its place in our society.
For those who aren't familiar with the case we're talking about, it's a case that's in the Fairfax, Virginia area, where the contention was that a race-neutral process in the high school still had a race-conscious basis. That was the objective. And because it had an objective of affecting race, that should be illegal by itself. And the district court held in favor of the plaintiffs, and then the Fourth Circuit reversed them.
That's right.
There is a high likelihood that this case will move towards the Supreme Court, given what's going on in this country. And I think it is important that people be aware of that. And I don't think, just so people understand, I don't think anyone in this call is going to suggest that the world has come to an end and that now we need to fold up and understand that affirmative action is over, diversity is over, and that it's all come to an end. The question might be, how do we consciously approach it so that no one can attack it? That's the key thing.
Can I jump in and ask Michael a question? And Michael, of course, affirmative action has a lot. You are probably one of the biggest employers in the country. You have one of the biggest budgets, one of the biggest organizations in New York City, and you have more contracts that go out probably than anybody else in the United States. How are you approaching this new world that you're going to be living in, where affirmative action around contracts no longer exists? What is your strategy going forward?
Well, what a strategy is going to be, once again, if the courts come down on race-based contracting, that means that we will no longer assign MWBE goals on those third-party contracts. And as Darrell would like to say, that may not be a bad thing. If we can now structure a focus on recruiting all businesses, giving them the opportunity to bid on contracts at the prime level. We know that you grow and develop these businesses at the prime level as opposed to the sub-level or subcontract level, because once you pay contractors at the prime level, they're in control of their own destiny. And so happen if a Black company gets a large contract, or an Hispanic company gets a large contract, they will hire people who look like them. If you want to go back to the origin of these programs that were called set-aside programs, that was created by the Nixon administration as a way of empowering Black businesses in light of the race riots that were occurring in most of your major cities during the late 1960s. And President Nixon, who was a capitalist, felt that if you empower Black businesses with set-aside contracts, they will hire people who look like them, and there will be a reduction in the unemployment in the Black community once you empowered Black businesses. And so that was the origin of the set-aside programs. And so we're optimistic that regardless of what decision comes down, that government and the private sector will still have the ability to create programs for all, but at the prime contract level, to engage businesses who may have been shut out of the marketplace previously and afford them opportunities to compete for contracts like anyone else.
Yeah, I've always been of the opinion, this is my opinion, not the my company's opinion, that hiring is good. Creating companies is generational wealth, though. And
Absolutely.
the more you can invest in Hispanic and African American companies at small companies to get larger contracts and grow generational wealth, will have a bigger impact on society than just hiring and affirmative action.
And you know, it's funny because in Chicago, where I grew up, there was a major contract on the Dan Ryan Expressway. And the elected officials were more concerned with jobs on those projects than they were with creating contract opportunities for Black and Hispanic owned businesses, because the economy was such that there was a 40% unemployment in the Black community. So they were more focused with creating jobs than creating contract opportunities.
And, you know, to take from what Mike said, you know, he said, I would say that, you know, not exactly say this might be a good thing. What I always do as a practicing lawyer is representing companies and defending them in employment issues is, and I have a case, I always think about not only how I would defend the situation, but what might be the initiative of the plaintiff bar to hurt my clients. And I think there's a lot of discussion about this, the impact of this case, as though the current situation of affirmative action is the holy grail, and it's something that we should be so happy we had. How could we possibly lose it? I think there's a lot of us who grew up in this country hearing about 10% set aside in affirmative action, going, we're lucky we get 8 to 10% and wouldn't even have affirmative action. Is that really true equity? And I think we've got to be thinking about the question, will the plaintiff bar now turn around and say, okay, you don't like this, let's become more aggressive. Let's find ways to go after and broaden the hierarchy. Let's take this decision and increase the diversity we have. So I think there's a possibility this might be a springboard for increased initiatives to change the diversity game plan. And to that end, you know, I know, Teddy, you're familiar with the University of California's Davis program currently. What do you think about their use of adversity analysis? Do we lose you, Teddy?
Yeah, it looks like he's frozen.
He's frozen again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
So I was going to make a point also.
Well, you know, can you hear me?
We
Yes.
can,
Not soon, we can hear you though. Go ahead, Teddy. Now we can.
Okay, can you hear me?
yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So your question is the University of California, Davis, and its use of the issue of people who have struggled with adversity. Is that right?
Right. And how they use the different things, different struggles they have as a calculation to add points to whether or not they should be chosen or not.
Yeah. Well, look, it seems to me that the Chief Justice and that language we keep returning to, nothing prevents a university from consider, et cetera, left a door open. And we are duty bound, I think, to pursue and push on that door. That means that the answer to your question about whether adversity can be considered, even if diversity on grounds of race, the Chief Justice says can't be. I think that we're duty bound to continue to push that on that door. Now, having said that, I am always nervous and have been uncomfortable ever since Bakke with any numerical connection with issues of race, because conservatives have turned that very quickly, you know where I'm going, into quotas.
Right.
And so I think we have to be careful about that.
That's why most
no matter
companies
where
we'll call them pledges today rather than quotas.
And whether they would accept that, I don't know. But I think we have to keep pushing, as I said, on this issue.
But Ted, the door that was left open has to do with, I just question whether writing a letter explaining my life struggles is going to have any impact whatsoever on an admissions board.
Well, look, as I said, Roberts said it, he wrote it, and I think that I want to see universities push on that issue, because other things have, the doors appear to be closing or closed. So I would say that we shouldn't say that we don't know what that means. Yes, we don't know exactly what it means, how it's going to play out, but we shouldn't abandon it. We need to pursue it. The other thing I really want to continue to press on, as I have been for a long time now, is the distinction between affirmative action and diversity.
Good.
They overlap. They are not the same.
Correct.
Affirmative action was the original justification for deliberate, conscious efforts to bring particularly, but not only African Americans into the fullness of opportunity. And the Supreme Court had all but killed that, or Justice Powell did in the Bakke case, and replaced it with diversity, which led me at first not to be a fan of diversity, but I've also defended diversity now for many, many years. And diversity has not only become a national priority, but it has become an international priority, right, and an international value. And I think that this Supreme Court carefully constructed 2 seats that I will say were hijacked, but a Supreme Court that has now ended up being adverse to civil rights and similar issues on behalf of opportunities for Black and brown people, not only in higher education, but in voting rights or whatever. My view is that this Supreme Court ultimately will not have the last word on all these issues, because self-interest alone is going to determine what corporations, companies, what institutions of higher education ultimately do. And we're going to live to see another day on these issues. I refuse to accept that this is the last word, particularly if it's coming from people who have long been opposed to any conscious efforts to address racial inequality. And that's who we have on the Supreme Court in the majority now.
Yeah.
And Jay, to what you talked about before, with your diversity analysis and the slides you point out, the necessity of corporate America or any employer to address diversity. And Michael, to your perspective, your role as a representative of one of the biggest cities in the world, we can't operate in this country with this concept of being, we're going to ignore diversity. Because at the end of the day, ignoring diversity is what existed before we had diversity, which was an all-white world, which was just not appropriate.
So Darrell, the point that you make and the point that Jay made previously, the private sector has never hired or did business with the Black community like they should. Government has always led diversity efforts, and the private sector has adapted to it. For example, after slavery, the post office was one of the first institutions to hire Blacks after slavery. But, the Black community is not disciplined enough to not buy goods and services from those corporations or companies that do not reflect the values of diversity. Let me give an example. 1972, the Reverend Jesse Jackson threatened to boycott GM because GM was not awarding Blacks dealerships in these major cities. And so the former CEO of GM went out to Chicago and met the Reverend Jesse Jackson, and they found a young Black superstar salesman, and they brought him to New York, and they awarded him a Oldsmobile dealership in the Bronx. And he was so spectacular in breaking sales that they awarded him a Cadillac dealership in the Bronx. And that was Dick Gidron. So the threat of a boycott of these major corporations will put pressure on leadership to diversify if their bottom line is going to be negatively impacted.
Right.
There's a situation going on right now where the Reverend Al Sharpton is threatening to boycott McDonald's, because historically speaking, McDonald's only give Black franchisees stores in Black neighborhoods and not high volume neighborhoods or areas like Times Square or 34th Street. And so those conversations are going on right now. And so government has always led with respect to diversity. At some given point in time, regardless of what the Supreme Court says, that if the Fortune 500 capital of the world where we reside, if the bottom line is going to be impacted, the private sector will find a way in order to appoint in a diverse manner and do business with diverse sources,
Right.
if their bottom line is going to be impacted.
Yeah,
And
Michael,
they know it is now. Yeah, I mean, the data is so clear.
yeah, and I want to follow up on that by saying that I've said that altruism may be a wonderful thing to some degree, but it's much less reliable than self-interest. And self-interest will demand that companies, corporations, that America, the footnote in this case for the military is an example. And then there's another part where the Chief Justice talks about, I think, shamefully, as pointed out by Justice Jackson, the need to consider race in the context of prisons. And these are necessities, but corporate America, all corners of America, have made clear in amicus briefs, in the Grutter case and the cases that followed, that diversity is not only an important value, but it's an absolute necessity for what they do.
Especially if they're a global company. Sorry, Michael.
Go
No,
ahead.
I was only going to say Ted's point of diversity is spot on. Think about the growth and evolution of hip hop. The music industry originally did not embrace hip hop, but 50 years later, it is the most popular or one of the most popular forms of music. I was in Israel. I was walking down the street in Jerusalem, a number of outdoor cafes and restaurants, and it was on a Saturday evening, and I'm hearing hip hop in Jerusalem of all places. And
Yeah.
so diversity is spot on, spot
Yeah.
on.
I've had that same experience in Eastern Europe, in Japan, around the world. And the truth is, and I'll fess up only for myself, when hip hop started, corporate America wasn't or the record industry weren't the only people that didn't embrace it. It came organically from the streets, and some of it I liked, some of it I didn't like, but I have to acknowledge that it changed the world.
Yeah. The thing that drives me a little bit crazy is this whole anti-woke movement today.
Yeah.
When they don't realize that woke is an African-American term for being awoken to systemic racism. And what they have taken the word and now saying anti-woke. What they're saying is stay asleep.
Mm-hmm.
I think they do know
Don't
that.
wake up.
I think they do know that, though. I think that's exactly what they know.
Yep.
But
I agree with you, Teddy. So, guys, as we go closer to the end of the thing, I think the question that a lot of people are going to have, the whole SAGES thing is, we know that this decision is meant to attack education. And we've mentioned the holes. I even mentioned, Duque, you and I talked earlier that to the degree that you can say you need to have an exception for the military, then to the degree that cities have police and fire departments and other central services, should you equally have to have an exception for them as well? If you have an exception for them, is there other possible locations in the private sector you need an exception as well because of the necessities that might be hidden in that whole argument regarding the military? To the point they made the question about, Roberts made the thing about using a letter. Does he leave the door open there? So this decision has a lot of doors open relative to, education, but to the degree it impacts employment or impacts the MWBE space, what I'm hearing from you guys, and correct me if I'm wrong, is the need has not changed. Even the court acknowledges there's still an issue. The only thing we have to do is, there's two things I'd see possibly here. One is consider how we approach it so that we keep in mind that there are those who are trying to attack it. But two, is it the end all, or maybe is this an opportunity to reevaluate what's currently being done and enhance it? What do you guys think about that? Mike, I'll let you start.
I think with these institutions of higher learning, with some of the most brilliant minds, they will figure it out in moving forward of how to increase and maintain diversity at those institutions of higher learning. Because I started out by asking Ted, what is the Black student population of your university overall? What is the Black student population of your law school? And what is the Black student population of your football and basketball teams? And so if an athletic director can hire coaches that can recruit student athletes that will allow them to compete for national championships every year because it's lucrative, in the light of a Black person who became the commissioner of the Big Ten Conference, who now has created the first national sports conference in the country, with the addition of USC and UCLA to the Big Ten. Now you have a conference extending from California all the way to New Jersey at Rutgers, and having the ability to have the Big Ten sign a $8 billion TV contract that every Big Ten school is the recipient off the top of $100 million from the TV deal up front. So these brilliant minds like Ted Shaw at these institutions of higher learning, they will figure this out. Because at the end of the day, these institutions have to be profitable. And if you can do it in sports on these campuses, certainly you can borrow some best practices from the athletic directors and the dean of the law schools and the dean of the business schools to make sure that that institution reflects the great diversity of where they may be located, including the city of New York, which is the most diverse city in the most diverse region in the world.
Well, and to answer your question, as you know, the University of North Carolina undergraduate African-American enrollment is still down in single digits. And the football team, of course, Black representation makes up a majority, I think, of the players on the football team, certainly on the basketball team. One of the things that I want to point out, talk about wokeness, is that some of these young people, some of these athletes, so I've heard some of them already say, don't play where you wouldn't otherwise be admitted. We'll see how that goes, if that goes anywhere. But not all of these athletes are asleep at the switch. They're aware of all of this, and to hear some of their voices.
Yeah. Can I ask one last question? We only got a few more minutes, Darrell, but I want to ask your opinion of the recent case against Harvard on their legacy programs. Because about 15% of their enrollment has to do with legacy, which are mostly white, legacy kinds of students. And now there's a suit against legacy as a different type of affirmative action that should be addressed.
Well, legacy is not an affirmative action. It can be addressed.
I know.
Teddy and I were talking about this earlier, and my immediate thought when I heard the legacy issue, and even before that case, was and Teddy, you can agree or disagree with me, is that the approach on that is going to be the disparate impact. I would almost want to bet that if you do an analysis, you'll find that the percentage of applicants coming in saying their legacy, I'm going to almost bet, I might be wrong, that there are few percentage-wise proportionally of Blacks getting opportunities through legacy than whites. What do you think, Teddy? Mm-hmm.
Well, we did talk about these lawsuit that's brought has to attack legacy on the basis of disparate impact, not on the basis of intent, because legacy itself also would not be cognizable as a protected classification under the Constitution. But disparate impact, yeah, that's a theory, and we'll see what happens with it, how far it goes. It's very interesting that this case is now pending, and I think we're going to see more challenges like that.
Hey, today, Ann, I have a question from the audience. I'm going to have just one thing I want to bring up, and I kind of alluded to this earlier. What's your thought to the possibility that, to the degree corporate America, that our employees decide to go to sleep at the wheel and say, we're not going to be diversity, we're not going to work on diversity, we're not going to initiative, would that force a likelihood of increased litigation or increased demands from shareholders for disparity studies and analysis, which would then evidence potentially discrimination on behalf of institutions requiring them take affirmative steps? What's your thought on that?
Darrell, who are you asking that question to?
You.
Oh, yeah. I actually, as I heard that question, I thought Jay might have answered that, or perhaps Michael. I think that I think we're going to continue to see those who are concerned about keeping the doors of opportunity open strike back in every and any way that they can. So the last strike back is not going to be this lawsuit that looks at legacy, and there are other cases that I think corporate America should be thinking about, or other instances in which corporate America should be thinking about, notwithstanding what the Supreme Court has said with respect to higher education admissions.
Well, with the disclosure laws, many investors, many customers, many consumers of products are looking at the SEC disclosure laws and seeing how corporations are disclosing their diversity efforts year after year to see if progress or not is being made. So I think this whole issue of disclosure is going to open a lot of eyes, both, as you said, with consumers, but also with possible investors in companies.
Mike, you got any input on that?
No, Ted and Jay answered that, but I just want to leave you with this, right? And I'm okay with being held to a standard. I am. I'm the first chief diversity officer in the history of the city of New York since 1624. I'm not sure if you were around in 1624, but I certainly wasn't. And when you talk about redlining, Ted, when you talk about Black veterans who came home from World War II who could not get a VA loan because simply of the color of their skin, when you talk about a Mike Garner who came from Harlem, grew up on the south side of Chicago, found myself in high school on the south side of Chicago. Ironically, the Obama Library is being built right across the street from my high school. And look up, I'm a sophomore, and I had an 8th grade book. And how do I know I had an 8th grade book? Because when I was in 8th grade, I had the same book. And so if you want to hold me to a standard, make sure that the allocation of resources in the community that I live is equal, and then hold me to a standard. But don't hold me to a standard and not have a remediation of a program that can bring me up from what you stopped me from getting in the first place.
Yeah.
What you said, Mike, one of the questions that was in the chat was a question about strategies companies can push to hard increase reputation. And to that end, a lot of companies are starting to shift away from the use of credentials, the requirements of certain degrees, because they really are artificial barriers. To the degree they, like schools are using, shifting away from the standardized tests, which again become increased barriers. If you're a second, third generation college grad, you can afford to have your children take a whole lot of preparatory courses. You're gonna do a lot better on those standardized tests than somebody else. So that's not necessarily a test of your intelligence. It's a demonstration of the fact you had more influence to be able to do better. And if you've been able to get out of school and get a college degree from a great school, the fact you came out of that great school doesn't necessarily mean that you're brighter than somebody else. It just means you got an opportunity someone else didn't get. So that if companies reevaluate how they start make selections of people being employed, some of those selection processes you have are artificial and not really a true test of talent.
Absolutely.
So I think what's going to require, the answer to your question is to the question raised. A lot of this is going to be developed and analyzed. Companies are going to have to do a lot of analysis and reviews, a lot of self-checking what they're doing, and decide what do they really need to operate in employment, what do they really need as outside vendors. And in doing that, they might find that they can accomplish the same or even more. One of the things I want to kind of end with is when I grew up in affirmative action, the concept people always saw affirmative action was that affirmative action meant that somebody who was less qualified got an opportunity that someone else should have gotten. I think Teddy and Mike, you'll probably share with me the fact that when we grew up, we knew affirmative action meant that someone who was 3 times more qualified than somebody else finally got the chance they should have gotten at the beginning.
Right. And the end note on that, Jackie Robinson, did Jackie Robinson not have the talent to play before 1947? No, he had the talent to play before 1947. He couldn't play in Major League Baseball because of the color of his skin. Yeah. And ironically, Jackie Robinson was not the most talented of those Negro baseball players.
Right.
But I guess the Dodgers felt that he had the temperament to withstand the harassment that he was going to face once he went to the major leagues.
Ted, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, I'm tempted. At one point, some years back, John Roberts said something about affirmative action that equated it to, moving in the outfield. And Jackie Robinson never wanted that to happen. So affirmative action was making less qualified people, giving them opportunity. And my response to that was no. What Jackie Robinson wanted, what affirmative action wants, is a chance to stand at the plate and to that opportunity. On standardized tests are so misused, and the companies, they won't say anything about that unless they're forced to. One of the things that has to happen is a hard look at the misuse and misapplication of standardized tests. This goes back both to the point you were making, Darrell, and it goes back, Michael, to the point you were making about the books that you used when you were in high school that you had seen in 8th grade, about opportunity and the opportunity to be prepared. Standardized testing, though, is something that the testing companies won't stand up behind the misuse of those tests if they're forced to. They will not tell you that standardized tests should be used at Stuyvesant High School as the sole criterion for admissions, even though most New Yorkers and people who think that that we shouldn't be doing something to make sure more Black students are admitted and brown students to Stuyvesant High School, and they think that that constitutes merit. One standardized test.
Yeah.
Testing companies won't even.
A nice movement in some of the better companies in the United States is the moving away from testing and degrees and looking at skills.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a starting of a movement in corporate America. Hopefully it continues, because I think skills is a level playing field.
Yeah. You won't
With
get.
that said, guys, it's past the 1 o'clock hour. I want to thank each of you for a fantastic presentation. I want to thank the audience for bearing with us, and to the degree we can have further conversation, I look forward to it. Wish everyone well.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Michael. Really
Thank you. Thank you.